Hi, everyone. I'm Roni Maisel. I teach here. And we're honored to have today with us Dr. Max Strassfeld for a talk on Trans Talmud, Androgynes and Eunuchs in Rabbinic Literature. This is his recent book. Dr. Strassfeld is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Arizona. His work spans religious studies and theory, Talmud and Rabbinic Judaism, Transgender Studies and queer theory, and gender in Jewish studies more broadly. His recent book that you see here above you and that I hope or gather that we'll hear more about now was published in 2022 by UC Press. And the book questions entrenched conceptions in both scholarship and contemporary political and cultural discourse about trans knowledge and trans experiences by closely tending to rabbinic sources and the theories or science or narratives of body and gender emanating from these sources. In doing so, Dr. Strassfeld is a pioneering voice in the fields of Talmud and Jewish studies more broadly, joining a cadre of select others in developing these new directions in the field, and so we're incredibly honored and happy that, to have him here with us today. The book was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award, and Dr. Strassfeld's work was recognized in other contexts as well. He was awarded multiple fellowships, among them by the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan, the Mellon Foundation, a cross-current fellowship at Auburn Seminary, the Berlin Prize, and a Hadassah Brandeis Institute Fellowship, among others. Join me in welcoming Max.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I always have that, who is that nice person they're talking about? And I'm like, oh, that's me. So thank you for the invitation to speak today and for everybody who helped pull together all the logistics to make this happen. Can you hear me okay in the back? Yeah? To the Center for Jewish Studies, to Duncan and Jennifer and Etta and Ethan and everybody who helped the behind-the-scenes piece, thank you. I also want to just briefly acknowledge that there's a lot of pain and grief and loss in the room tonight. And just not because I have anything of wisdom to share with you all about it, but just after 3 years of a pandemic, I'm not a fan of business as usual. So I just wanted to acknowledge that we come with heavy hearts. And for anyone who's carrying pain and grief tonight, I'm sorry. So my instruction from the organizers was to give a talk that can work for community members and faculty members and graduate students and undergraduates, which is a tall order. So here's what I'm going to do. I tried to pitch it broadly in a way that I think will be accessible for most people. If I miss the mark and you have clarifying questions as I go, you should feel free to stop me and ask clarifying questions, and there will be time for discussion at the end as well. Okay, so I want to briefly introduce everyone to rabbinic literature and categories of androgynes and eunuchs. This will be review for at least some of you. And then I'm going to take us through a little bit of my theoretical approach. What does it mean to trans the Talmud? And we'll look at some text together. That's my agenda for the day. So when we are talking about rabbinic literature in 3 sentences or less, what we are talking about is a body of literature produced in roughly the first 6 centuries of the Common Era, comes out of a movement called the Rabbinic movement, which is a movement that spans Roman Palestine to the west and the Sasanian Empire to the east. I'm oversimplifying all of this, of course, but that's the kind of who, what, when, where we are. And the Talmud is the most famous compilation to come out of this movement. It's not a genre of writing, if you haven't encountered it before, it's not a genre of writing any of us are familiar with. It has what could be loosely called legal sources, stories about the rabbis, we'll see some of those, medical advice, ritual prohibitions, biblical interpretation. Right? My book studies eunuchs and androgynes within rabbinic literature. Up until quite recently, this was not a topic that had received a lot of scholarly attention. And if you're interested, you should definitely check out Charlotta von Roberts' work, who is here today, Gwyn Kessler's work, and Sarah Lev. So there's a group of us now that are working with these texts. So I want to just briefly introduce us to the broad range of bodies that I'm loosely translating as eunuchs and androgynes. And you do not need to memorize or hold on to all the details about them. Mostly what I want you to notice is that when I'm using these English terms, eunuchs and androgynes, the kinds of embodiment that I'm indexing with those English terms is much broader than we tend to think of with the English terms. So just pay attention to the broad range of kinds of bodies we're talking about. The rabbis inherit their term eunuch from the Hebrew Bible. So saris comes from the Hebrew Bible, although there is a lot of debate in biblicists about how often it means eunuch. And anyone who wants to go down that rabbit hole, feel free to ask me in the discussion later. So the basic term they do not invent, right? But they develop the term and add some distinctions into the category. So for the rabbis, the saris, the eunuch, refers to people who undergo changes to their bodies, to their genitalia later in life. So somebody who's born, assigned male at birth, experiences changes to their genitalia or their body that mean that they're not going to be reproductive. That's what we tend to think of as eunuch in the English, right? But for the rabbis also, to be a eunuch could be someone who's born with some kind of bodily differences that mean that they're not going to be able to reproduce. And those folks, if they were born today, we might call them intersex, but for the rabbis, that was a type of eunuch. And we could think a little bit about the Greek term and the semantic flexibility within the Greek term that's mirrored in their expansive definition of saris here, of eunuch here. So we have both people who are assigned male at birth, who have changes to their bodies, and then both men and women who are born without the capacity to procreate. And all of these, to a degree, are kind of conceptually related. I would call those eunuch in English. The other kind of broad umbrella I'm using in the English is androgyne. So we have at least two types of androgynes. I'm going to talk about two. One is the androgynos. So that is a person where we know from some early texts, we'll see that they are described as having the capacity to menstruate and have seminal emissions. So that gives us some idea or some guess about their body. And the other is the tumtum. And the tumtum is described differently in different places. The best basic definition of the tumtum is that their sex is uncertain. Some places we have a description of a flap of skin covering their genitalia. It might be revealed, maybe it's a liminal category. But the basic understanding of the tumtum is that we don't actually know what their sex is. So you can think of those as conceptually linked, right? You have the androgynos, who has a surplus of sex signs, and the tumtum, who has a dearth. So when I talk about eunuchs and androgynes in rabbinic literature, that's shorthand for a whole number of different specific categories that really don't match our English terms terribly well. And also, I want us to notice that they don't match our taxonomies of sex gender very well, right? So if we think about, for example, the distinction between intersex and transgender today, which we consider to be discrete categories, the term intersex, for example, assumes that that a diversity of different bodily conditions fit under this umbrella. So it's a particular way of organizing sex, right? So if for the rabbis, the term eunuch is also an umbrella term, but notice that for them, one can be born with sex differences, right? Someone we might today label intersex. One can also undergo changes to their body later in life. That is not usually someone we would call intersex. We would associate that form of embodiment more likely with some trans, right? So these are not an intellectual distinction. Our whole taxonomies of sex gender, the way we think about these distinctions don't really match or mesh neatly. And I think it's important to notice the ways our taxonomies are different from rabbinic taxonomies, and I'll circle back around to that later. Okay, so if I don't think that they are intersex or transgender literally, why did I call the book Trans Talmud? Excellent question. First of all, to be completely honest, I didn't really want to call the book Trans Talmud. I wanted to call the book Transing the Talmud because that is a more accurate representation of what I'm trying to do. I was trying to avoid the impression that either the Talmud or the eunuchs or androgynes are somehow inherently, essentially trans, right? It's not a good title. The publisher didn't like it. I lost that battle. Fine, I totally get it. But I want to talk to you about what I mean by transing, which is actually the theoretical framework for the book. So first of all, I do not originate this term transing, right? It's a verb playing with that prefix trans from the word transgender. It's first used in a talk by Joanne Meyerowitz, who's a trans historian. And then I can trace it into this introduction by Susan Stryker, Paisley Carra, and Lisa Jean Moore in Women's Studies Quarterly in their introduction to a special issue. And so I'll just read it quickly, and then I'm going to draw your attention to a couple of different aspects of this definition. Transing is a practice that assembles gender into contingent structures of association with other aspects of bodily being, and that allows for reassembly. Transing can function as a disciplinary tool when the stigma associated with lack or loss of gender status threatens social intelligibility. It can also function as an escape vector, a line of flight, or pathway towards liberation. So there's a lot to say about what they're doing here. I'm not going to take you through all of the aspects of this definition, all of the ways they're using transing or I am, but I want you to notice a couple of things. One, they're emphasizing the way that different aspects of bodies are being combined with one another to create meaning. And that they create meaning in concert with one another, and that these are contingent. So for those of us who are historians, that it's contingent and can be combined or assembled and reassembled. For those of you with the theoretical, with your theoretical ears on, assembly is not an accident, that word there, right? We notice that there's not a stable body. Aspects of the body and the meanings associated with them can be combined and recombined. Notice also that transing can mean two very opposite things for our authors. It can function as a disciplinary tool, and it can be a pathway towards liberation. Right? So there's a tension there. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to live in the tension between the disciplinary tool and the path to liberation. That's how I've organized it. So first, I want to think for a minute about transing as a disciplinary strategy. One of the ways that I use transing is to think about how certain bodies are made to carry the weight of gendered, sexual, and other kinds of bodily failures. So all bodies change through time. Only some of those changes are considered pathological or damage to the body. Other changes are naturalized. For example, the classic example in trans studies, Lots of different bodies experience hormonal shifts in their lifetimes. Lots of different people may even take supplementary hormones. Yet only some of these uses of hormones are labeled a sex change and regulated differently in medicine, right? Another example relevant to my texts, anyone who has struggled to have a child can tell you that reproduction, even when you have all of the necessary components to hand available to you, is never guaranteed. So when we talk about reproductive failures in rabbinic literature, there's a general acknowledgement in both the Bible and in rabbinic literature that reproduction is fraught, that it can fail. We have all sorts of stories about this, right? So in analyzing the non-reproductive eunuchs then, I step back and ask a naive question. If everyone can fail to reproduce, and in fact we have all these legal structures that acknowledge this, like levirate marriage, what is it that makes the procreative failures of eunuchs pathological or unique exactly? Why are their procreative failures of a different caliber? And I can tell you some of the technical formal reasons, right? But I find that it is sometimes helpful to ask those naive questions to try and figure out the underlying logics of the sources. So that is one of the ways I'm using transing and thinking about the disciplinary strategies of transing in the book. The way that I am exploring the discipline of gendered bodies originates out of a particular time and place. I wrote this book almost entirely within the political pushback happening in the US against trans people. So I want to read closely one rabbinic source and one anti-trans legal source as part of a way to work through this idea about transing as a disciplinary strategy. Also, I'm saying it's Tosefta Bikurim. We could talk about whether it's actually the Tosefta and the Mishnah. I suspect there's only one person in the room besides me who might care about that issue. But if you are that person and I didn't realize that, you can ask also at the discussion. Okay, so the most programmatic text, the one everybody cites, which Gwyn Kessler also says, maybe we should stop paying this much attention to this text, but I'm going to do it because this is the one that everybody cites. I think, though, she has a point. It comes from early rabbinic literature and begins with a kind of topic statement. So very much in the genre of Tannaitic lists. It has your topic statement, and then it divides up in sections. Good memorization tool, very practical format, right? So here we have the topic statement. In the case of the androgyne, there are ways that he is equivalent to men. There are ways that he is equivalent to women. There are ways that he is equivalent to both men and women, and there are ways in which he is not equivalent to either men or women. So first of all, translation of these kinds of texts is a problem. We have the androcentric conventions of Hebrew that mean that the masculine is the default. So sometimes I've translated this text using third gender pronouns. Sometimes I've translated this text using singular they. I'll just put a pin, notice the discomfort of trying to translate this text, that both English and Hebrew struggle, given the grammatical conventions, struggle with the translation. Okay, so here we have our topic statement, and then the rest of the text is organized into these four headings. Here's how the androgyne is like men, like women, etc. Right? The list begins, I'll give you a couple of examples. So the list begins by describing how the androgyne functions as a man. So he becomes ritually impure by seminal emissions. Remember I said there was a text that gives us some indications about the body of the androgyne. This is that text. So he becomes impure through seminal emissions like men do. He has to uphold all the positive commandments in the Bible, by implication, including the commandments from which women are excluded generally. He also must marry but not be married. So for those of you with the Hebrew, noseh aval lo nisa. Like, you could not come up with a more succinct description of androcentrism in rabbinic marriage law than those 6 words. I mean, it's like perfect, right? So you marry actively, the verb in the active, you marry like a man does to a woman, right? And then in the passive, right, the androgyne is not married in the passive like a woman is to a man. So that active-passive grammar is standing in for the kinds of gendered obligations there. Then we have some examples of how the androgyne is like a woman. He becomes ritually impure through menstruation, like women. He's disqualified from being a legal witness, like women are. Both the obligations and the stringencies and exclusions that pertain to women are applied to the androgyne. The category of being like women, like men, like women, there's already a kind of comparison built in, but this being like women, there's a kind of double comparison already, not just because of that language of equivalence, of shaveh, but also because there is a way that the androgyne is equivalent to women both by undertaking the obligations of women, but also by observing the stringencies that mark women as not men. In other words, you only have to say that women and androgynes do not function as legal witnesses when you have a context where other groups do already, right? So the androgyne is like women, therefore, in the ways their legal subjectivity is curtailed. Everyone following? Clarifying questions so far? Are we good?
Ask a question?
Yeah, go for it.
Why do you need to use a male pronoun in the English? If I read the Hebrew, I see the bo, yesh bo drach, maybe I'm wrong, that it's not. Yesh drachim shaveh equal to people in the masculine, and there are ways that the androgynous is equal to, but the bo refers to the drachim, I think. Why insist on a masculine pronoun in English?
First, I don't insist on a masculine pronoun. I've translated differently pretty much every time I teach this text. I think it's awkward.
You dropped the first bo. You're missing one bo, so but that's the.
Oh, yes. Well, I don't. Yes.
But
the bo I think refers to the way that I think it refers to the androgyne. I don't think it refers to drachim in that. And we have not to.
Drachim would generally be found. Right. Well, it was referring to drachim, but drachim ba is not considered either. So the bo probably.
Yeah. So we have a place in the text where we see the gender switch. So I'll get to this in a minute, but they're deliberately trying to figure out what to do with the gender of the androgyne. But I think it's like the problem with translating in the masculine, right, is that it forecloses the question that the text seems to be trying to ask. So any way you do it, you're either papering over the androcentrism, or you are papering over the complexities of the fact that they're trying to ask a question that's even hard to ask in the language they have. And I feel torn every time about which thing to paper over is basically my problem. Thank you. Are there other clarifying questions so far? Everyone following? Okay. Okay. So, this is a matter of basic prosaic questions about the status of the androgyne in relation to specific laws. It's also raising some deeper questions. If for the rabbis, as other scholars have argued, the ideal legal subject is the one with the most obligations under the law, having more obligations is positive. So when they're comparing the androgyne to being like men, like women in that way, they are working the androgyne into the legal system, as Charlotta has argued. There may be some practical difficulties. So the laws of seclusion mean that the androgyne seems to not be permitted to be alone with people that they're not related to of either gender. So that seems slightly impractical, right? But there is an effort to establish the androgyne as a legal subject. More specifically, the list implies that the androgyne even has a place within androcentric marriage laws, although that gets undone in various layers of the text. But if you just had this text, you might think, no, they can get married, right? So there's a kind of integration into kinship structures too on the face of it. The overall effect is to weave the androgyne within the social and legal fabric. If the strategy of the list is to incorporate a variety of sexed bodies into law, the coda takes a different approach. It's in the coda that we find the first attributed statement, although, again, there's a debate about who this should actually be attributed to. Rabbi Yossi disagrees. Rabbi Yossi said, the androgyne is unique, and the sages could not decide about him whether he is a man or she is a woman. Sorry, the period ended up in the same place. The PowerPoint does not like Hebrew. So the androgyne is unique or sui generis, right? Bria, you can see the Hebrew there if you have that. So Rabbi Yossi disagrees with the approach of the sages in the list. He assumes that to participate in the law, the sages would have had to designate the androgyne as either a man or a woman. As evidenced by their enumeration of the different legal roles the androgyne has throughout the list, they couldn't do that. They did not assign the androgyne a gender. And for Rabbi Yossi, the implication of this failure is that the androgyne is excluded completely from the rabbinic legal project. The final statement undoes the work of carefully fitting the androgyne into the system. At first reading, then, the list, coda, diametrically opposed. The effects for the androgyne are totally different. Well, that's true. I do argue, in fact, both the list and the coda Both the list and Rabbi Yossi are substantially sharing a vision of the importance of gender in law. For the framers of the list, gender is a central organizing principle, right? Like men, like women, this is how we schematize the categories of law. Even the categories equivalent to both, equivalent to neither, are formulated through a kind of reification of gender and a reinscription of the centrality of gender. For the coda, gender is so essential that the rabbis can't include the androgyne into law, right? The comprehensiveness of the law, as Charlotta says, is sacrificed. The outcome radically different from the androgyne, but both the sages and the coda can be understood to be in collusion to establish the centrality of gender in law. This list then does not reflect the gendered nature of rabbinic law. Instead, I would argue this text becomes one key articulation of gender in law. This is constructing, this is doing constructive work. The question of gendered ontology is taken up in Trans Studies by the theorist Ava Hayward. She cites the activist Laverne Cox and notices the way trans women in particular are commanded don't exist. One way to combat that murderous imperative, don't exist, might be to insist on the humanity of trans women and trans women of color in the face of this erasure. Hayward chooses a different path. Drawing on Black feminist theory, She says any attempt to revise this category of the human is compromised by foundational anti-Black and misogynist logics that animate the category altogether. And she's citing habeas fiscus. She's citing a whole bunch of theory there. Instead, she says, push against ontology itself. Ontology is the ultimate architect of the mandate don't exist. Unlike contemporary trans women of color, the androgyne is not told don't exist. The rabbis understood these bodies, in fact, I would argue, to be created by God. The phrase that I'm translating as sui generis or unique, right, could be more literally rendered. The androgyne is a creation unto themselves. That word creation, same verb that comes from Genesis, reverberates, if you're familiar with the verse in Genesis, right? We see it elsewhere in rabbinic literature in this time period being used to describe creatures created by God. While it's not an overt theological statement in that way, it certainly brings with it the echoes of that context. It is even perhaps an oblique reference to the Midrash. This is a little bit of a reach, but there are stories that circulate in the rabbinic corpus talking about Genesis, reading some of these verses as the creation of the androgyne. Right, so Genesis 1:27, in particular, male and female God created them. It's a different kind of androgyne. It's not this kind of androgyne, but there is already a kind of association with that verse and the androgyne. The language that names the androgyne as a unique creation is what makes this text so attractive to trans and intersex activists and rabbis. It's part of the reason why it shows up everywhere, right? I want to turn now to the contemporary debates over ontologies of sex and gender in law to examine a very different reception of Genesis. Several contemporary anti-trans bills pair a definition of marriage as heterosexual and monogamous with a definition of sex gender. And I could take you through, the complementarian Christian evangelical theologies that are the kind of substructure of that, how we get here. But I'll just say for shorthand, they often refer to Adam and Eve. So these ideas that there are two people created, that the gender and heterosexuality are a kind of reflection of the story of the Garden of Eden. And we should, in that way, reflect the relationship between Adam and Eve. That's the basic reductive version of what that complementarianism means. We could all have lots of questions about why we want to reflect Adam and Eve, right? But that's the kind of basic theological framework. So I want to read closely the language of one of these so-called bathroom bills. This is a religious freedom bill. This is Mississippi House Bill 1523. It regulates, among other things, trans people's access to public facilities. The law was challenged in court. There was a preliminary injunction. It was overturned, and it's the law of the land. So the opening clauses of this anti-trans law define what specific religious beliefs are protected. So this is a religious freedom law. The first two protected religious beliefs are A, marriage is or should be recognized as the union of a man or a woman, of a man and a woman, right? So this is the heterosexual marriage clause, one man, one woman. And B, sexual relations are properly reserved to such a marriage. So how this works is if you are acting based on these religious beliefs, you hold these religious beliefs and you decide, I don't wish to rent my apartment to this unwed pregnant woman, right? That's not discrimination then, that's protected as under religious freedom laws. Make sense? That's kind of how the picture, this is how this law works. So So notice within the context of the bill, it's a protected religious belief that sex should be both heterosexual and monogamous. Notice also the language of is or should be, right? First clause, evocative of a wish to reframe heterosexual marriage, even as it protects the belief in that reframing. There's a gap between the ideal and reality built into the clause itself, right? Presumably that's why it needs protecting. If the world reflected these ideals, like it's an implicit argument. But it also acknowledges that this is not how sex and marriage is practiced, at least in this time. Right? Similarly, sexual relations are properly reserved, right? Dead giveaway. That we know that that's not actually how sex is happening across the board. So in this section of the bill, religious beliefs are counterfactual. The bill envisions a different social order, right? The counterfactual nature means that actions you take to bring about this social order, right? This is not discrimination. This is your manifesting your religious will. The third clause functions differently, though, right? So if the first two are counterfactual, the third clause is different. It reads, male, in parentheses, man, or female woman refer to an individual's immutable biological sex as objectively determined by anatomy and genetics at time of birth. So if marriage is the union between one man and one woman, we need to define what those are. Here, I have a definition for you. Here's the clause that does that, right? So let's leave aside for the moment that genetic testing is not widely practiced on all newborns. First conceptual problem. Let's also leave aside the fact that anatomy and genetics do not also align. That's what intersex activists have said about laws like this, right? So there's all those kinds of definitional problems within this clause to begin with. Notice the wording of the rest of the clause. So we have those parentheses, male, man, female, woman. So we're collapsing sex and gender, right? Sex and gender are immutably assigned at birth. And it functions then as a claim that objective sex-gender identity is both biological, immutable, and determined at birth. Here's the other weird thing about this language. Once we invoke biology, anatomy, genetics, that also introduces the question of science and medicine into a bill designed to protect and define religious belief. Medicine and religion collude to determine the immutable truth of sex at birth. From the perspective of the apparent divide between the secular, scientific, and the religious, this leads to a certain incoherence. Is it a scientific belief that sex is immutable? Belief and hypothesis are usually positioned as different registers. These are different ways to understand the world, right? But we're defining religious belief that science assigns sex. Even as scholars in religious studies have very persuasively argued that secularism in the US is much more complicated, this explicit invocation of secular science and medicine and a religious freedom bill should make us pause. I have some theories around what's happening in the US around fights over epistemology right now. I won't lay them all out, but if you're interested, I have a theory about why this is happening and why it's happening now. But the effect is clear. When the law entwines the scientific and theological, it conspires to naturalize a divinely ordained gender binary. So we have both working in tandem. Science and God do not believe in the existence of transsexuals, right? Makes sense? I mean, makes sense the argument? Let me qualify that. So in consequences, the rest of the bill describes discrimination, refusal of services, right? That's transubstantiated, that's transformed. It's not discrimination. It's the material instantiation of a protected religious belief that trans people are impossible. It's manifesting into reality a religious belief in the gender binary, and it's closing that gap between religious ideals and gender norms. It works very differently then than those first two clauses. So part of what I'm arguing here is that queer and trans are not always commensurable. This is a place where that distinction, the difference between should not exist and does not exist, infinitesimal, one word, but also huge. So nothing here says anything about Genesis, right? This is a secular law passed by the state of Mississippi. I'm arguing that it has something to do with Genesis because we have a lot of journalism that says, here's where this language actually comes from. So the Alliance Defending Freedom, which I'll call ADF, Christian legal organization that lists marriage, religious freedom, and the sanctity of life as core to their agenda. An earlier version of the language is found in proposed school policies on bathrooms. So the ADF said, here's a policy restricting what kind of people can use what bathrooms. If your school district adopts this policy and gets sued, we'll defend you pro bono, right? So they write policies, they write the text of laws, they distribute them as part of their advocacy, and they try and get institutions, states to pick this up. We can trace directly, Mother Jones has done this, how this language in this bill comes from statements by the ADF. They are very clear in their statement of faith that they explicitly are citing Genesis 1:27 to argue that sex and gender should be immutable, assigned at birth by anatomy and genetics. And there's been some versions, you can trace the different versions with the way back. I have some with screenshots of their statement of faith. They've revised it, but you can see their invocation of that verse, Genesis 1:27, as their proof text, right, that transsexuals should not, cannot exist. In other words, the precise verse the rabbis use to argue in other contexts about the creation of an androgyne, that is the precise verse that the Alliance Defending Freedom is using to argue for the impossibility of trans people. My point is not that the ADF is interpreting the verse wrong. That's not my particular argument. Nor is my point that the rabbis are liberatory and we should go back to their system and these laws are oppressive. Both of these are attempts to make ontological statements about the relationship between gender and law in very different contexts and times and places. I am trying to say, however, to point out that the claim of a kind of timeless Judeo-Christian investment in sex and gender binary that is being promulgated right now, and that points to biblical texts, specifically Genesis, as the origin of the idea of the gender binary, is way too reductive, right? So the claim, the ADF says, this is what this verse means, this is what this verse has always meant, this is what Genesis says, right? Of course, I mean, they're not scholars and theologians, right? Whatever, but that story, that is not just the story that they're telling, but we're seeing it in lots of different places. That is a very reductive reception history of that particular verse. The marked increase in the introduction of anti-trans bills actually comes during the Obama presidency. This is not because Obama himself supported a conservative agenda in relation to trans people. I think it's actually because we can understand this is a part of a conservative array of tactics designed to push back against his presidency. In other words, we can think of these anti-trans laws within a broader white conservative Christian nationalist project that gained traction in the Trump era, but was by no means initiated by him. Just consider for a moment the long white supremacist, ableist, and sexist history of regulating the space of bathrooms. Scholar Sheila Kavanaugh has argued that the whiteness of the porcelain in bathrooms is not accidental. Discourses of hygiene are often racialized, ableist, and used in the service of regulating space and public space. If we think about the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, which was signed into law in March 2022, and which prohibits teachers from instructing students about sexual orientation or gender identity, the discourse, we can see that the discourse around regulating trans people has moved into new areas. So here I have the tweet that went viral from the then press secretary, Pushaw. The bells are very loud. So she tweets, the bill that liberals inaccurately call Don't Say Gay would be more accurately described as an anti-grooming bill. If you're against the anti-grooming bill, you're probably a groomer, or at least you don't denounce the grooming of 4 to 8-year-old children. Silence is complicity. Grooming usually is a word to describe the practice of predators trying to prepare children to accept sexual contact with them. That's what grooming means more generally. By characterizing teaching about sexual orientation or gender identity as grooming, as sexual predation, they're stigmatizing education about these topics, right? And reports by HRC and others found that these accusations were very effective. In the wake of this tweet, which went viral, accusations against trans and queer people on social media went up over 400%. So this tactic has been has gained a lot of traction. As a strategy, if grooming characterizes intergenerational learning as a form of abuse, it's also important to notice that intergenerational learning has also been a really important strategy by which queer and trans people pass down the skills of survival. This is how we pass down our tools, right? By stigmatizing learning, this is not just an attack on our youth. This is nothing less than an all-out assault on a trans future. And I think, by the way, that this is very much a part of the other kinds of politics we're seeing around education right now. There's a broader fight over race and knowledge transmission and production. I think these need to be understood all of a piece. What's part of what I'm arguing is that we can understand anti-trans laws within a larger white Christian nationalist agenda. The image in the middle of this slide, by the way, is Skylar Morrison, who's a trans teen who testified before the Arizona legislature about the law that then was signed in the bill around trans medicine that was signed into law. The person with the Stop Killing Black Trans Women is Quentin Bell, who's the executive director of Knights and Orchids, which is an organization for Black, queer, and trans folks across the South. There's some really important activism happening in QTPOC organizations across the southern half of the US. Boy, the bells really go on for a while, too. They just keep going. Sorry, you all. I want to end with the third way that Carra, Stryker, and Moore are defining transing as a path of flight, path towards liberation. To do that, I want to read a short selection from the book. I'm going to tell you the story, the text of which is here. Very short story from the Talmud. I'll summarize it to make it a bit easier to parse. And then I'm going to read you my retelling of the story. Wait, I just realized I need my book to do that. Apologies. Okay, so here's the story. The story basically goes, you have a very famous rabbi, Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, for those for whom that name means something. He wants to go study with a new teacher. He goes to study with that new teacher. The new teacher's students band together against him like the fighting cocks of Beit Bukia, the fighting roosters of Beit Bukia. These famous roosters only mentioned here in the Talmud. But it's a very aggressive image, right? They're protecting their territory. They're protecting access to their teacher. And they don't want to give Rabbi Yehuda Anasi access. And they're largely successful. Only one teaching is allowed to slip through. He learns about a debate over which kinds of sex with an androgyne break the law in Leviticus. In other words, what kinds of sex with an androgyne break the law against men having sex with men lying with men? The stakes of this question are quite high. The punishment in Leviticus for breaking this rule is being stoned to death. So, important question. When I first read the story, I could really feel the gendered complications of the text. The penetrated body of the androgyne seemed to function as a kind of currency to use to negotiate the borders between two groups. There's a poetic aspect to this contrast between the hypermasculine barrier presented by the students and the roosters, who nevertheless allow this just one teaching to slip through, this teaching about the multiply penetrable body of the androgyne. Right? So there's a whole gendered sexual poetics, deeply problematic, but poetics happening here. And we could say also, this is a complex negotiation over the reproduction of knowledge. Rabbi Yehuda Anasi barred from access to knowledge he seeks by this band of students. So they're successful on the one level. At the same time, students are nameless. Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, pretty famous, right? So there's a way where if the purpose is to serve as a link in the chain of transmission, then the students lose the game by refusing to play. But we can also understand this as a contest over the reproduction of knowledge, again, played out over this discussion of non-reproductive sex acts. So again, a kind of poetics of the reproduction of knowledge. That is certainly one way to read the story. It is one way I read the story. It's satisfying to a degree, but it also makes me very aware of the fact that we don't have sources that represent the perspectives of androgynes and eunuchs in rabbinic literature, right? There is no version of a text that's debating what kinds of sex get you stoned to death that is the stuff of queer or trans liberation, right? This is not an inherently liberating text, and we lack any of the perspectives that might help us fill out what this meant, what the significance is. As I was writing the book, I thought about what it would be like to imagine the voices of the figures I discuss since I don't have access to them. So I wrote a very brief short story, and I collaborated with an artist, Nikki Green, a fabulous trans Jewish artist whose work is on the right there, to illustrate it. And I will read you that story now. As I read and reread the story in the writing of this chapter, I began to imagine what Rabbi Yehuda Anasi's narrative might look like from the perspective of roosters and androgynes. How might the androgynos and the roosters understand their own relationship? Their version of the tale may be unrecognizable to us, a narrative world in which animals and androgynes do not function as props. Perhaps on one silent, warm afternoon, a capon and an androgynos sit beside one another. A capon is a castrated rooster. The roosters were castrated because it makes the meat more tender, supposedly. They move as little as possible in order to capture wayward breezes. Their stillness makes them appear inanimate from afar. After a while, the capon inclines their head to the androgynos, and the androgynos strokes them carefully, avoiding the capon's scars. The androgynous trails their fingertips along the shifting colors and textures of the capon's feathers, and they both lean back simultaneously to watch the clouds of dust that are the only mark of the retreating rabbis. As if, mutters the androgynous. The capon cocks their head quizzically, shivering with pleasure at the androgynous' gentle, teasing fingertips. As if I wanted any of them. And then the androgynous picks up a tan stone, worn smooth, a pebble, really. They toss it lightly, innocuously. The capon watches as the stone indents where it lands, creating a ripple of dust. And then the capon's sharp talons close about the androgynous' finger, squeezing gently. A small bead of blood forms. The breeze finally arrives, tossing hair and feathers playfully, and the androgynous and the capon incline toward one another incrementally in silent enjoyment. Some stories may be lost to us. We may still imagine what they might have said. So that's my spiel. Thank you. I think we have some time for questions. If people have to rush off, I totally understand.
Do you want to field questions?
Yeah. Oh.
Is this good or is this bad?
It's kind of nice, actually. I can see the text much better.
Yes. So you mentioned that in theory they could marry, but that there were other places that might have hedged that a bit. Would you mind saying a little more about that?
Yeah. So then they try and argue it's how do you say b'di'evet and ex post facto, or I forget the sort of English, right? So if you did it already, like, okay, they try and say, well, that is, if he did it already, that counts as a marriage and therefore needs to be undone. So they take away the context of what on the face of it seems to be permission to marry, and instead interpret that as a legal action has taken place, and therefore a divorce also needs to happen. And the question is that originally what that source actually meant? Perhaps, perhaps not. But there are very early interpretations that understand the Nosea Valonisa in that way. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you for this talk. Really appreciate it. And the drawing, which is quite beautiful. I'm just curious, I think I'm understanding your argument to be essentially that here in America you have a sort of anachronistic attempt to sort of naturalize, as you say, a divinely ordained binary, which is not sort of religiously or historically universal, but purports to be such. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what I'm understanding one of your arguments to be here, right?
Yeah.
But I guess I would ask, the people that we're talking about here in the Talmud, in the Tosefta, as you say, they don't exactly map onto what we understand as trans today. So I wonder if that complicates your argument, because if you're looking for sort of evidence contrary to this Christian conception, well, the Talmud can be useful, but it's not maybe as dispositive. That's just what I'm thinking, because you see that you have intersex people, you have people who've lost the function of their genitalia, but you don't have people who have transitioned, it seems, as we would understand that in our parlance today. Am I missing something?
No, I mean, so part of what I'm threading very carefully there, or trying to, is to say that the claim that there was always a sex-gender binary, that needs to be historicized. I don't think there are trans people in antiquity, but the claim that Genesis means that Judaism has been timelessly and essentially invested in a sex-gender binary, that is a kind of reductive understanding of that reception history. But absolutely, the folks that are going to really argue against some of these kinds of claims are the theologians, right? The trans theologians are the ones that are really doing the work of constructing a positive counter theology that argues against, in a more holistic sense, the way that Genesis is being invoked. The other kind of piece I would say that I find useful about that fact that that our sex-gender system can then be historicized by the fact that we have these archives that are doing something very different, right? The kind of the undoing that naturalization, that these things have to be natural and timeless, that there is a kind of hope in that. The idea that it was not always like in this way, this particular punishing construction comes from a particular time and place. It's not that the past has to be better, it just has to be different in order to allow us to imagine that the future might also be different.
Sure. I just had one more question along these lines. I'm sorry. One of the things that obviously there's been this push in the scholarship of Talmud and other religious law texts in the past 2 decades to sort of try to understand how law interacted with everyday practice. And I guess I would ask you if, directly or indirectly, we have some sort of historical or legalistic, any sort of textual evidence outside the Talmud, either in Palestine or Babylon, that you are reading in tandem with these Talmudic passages to understand historically how gender complex individuals were viewed by law and society.
Yeah, what a great question. And every historian is going to tell you, boy, do I wish my archive was bigger. So yes, of course, I really wish, that piece, the kind of just constitutive piece that we lack their perspectives, that is true across the board. I don't have, you have in Greco-Roman sources, in the Second Sophistic movement, you have records of people that are identifying as essentially born eunuchs, but they're filtered through they're complicated sources. They're filtered through particular perspectives of a kind of rhetorical battle between these two figures. So that's going to be a polemical context, right? So most of the historical sources, and there's lots, because the rabbis aren't the only ones interested in eunuchs and androgynes. Androgynos, the word in Hebrew, right? Very clear Greek loan word there, that our English comes from also. Eunuch, while we have saris, we have a Hebrew term, arguably the kinds of distinctions they're making are very much in line with the way that the Greek word eunuch works. And we see that in the Christian Bible in Matthew 19:12. There's a verse that talks about eunuchs who are born and eunuchs who become, right? Very similar distinction. So there's lots of texts that all come with their own kinds of limitations and polemical context. But and then the question of what that means for material reality, right? That is also another piece. So each of these texts will have their own complicated relations. We also have lists of prodigies in Rome. So these are lists of babies that were exposed. So there was a concept in some strains of Roman religion that certain kinds of births were indications of, something's wrong with the natural order. And if we leave these babies out to die, that will reset the natural order. There's a bunch of scholarship that says probably this didn't happen very much, but we do have some prodigy lists that list androgynes. So we know it happened some, right? So we have some hints of some aspects of material life in some parts, sometimes in places, not enough, and not really enough to make some really strong claims about the relation between these texts and material reality.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for the great questions. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the talk. Great talk. So my question is sort of like a somewhat unfair question because it takes you at least a little bit.
You're going to ask me about secularism?
No, fair. No, it's not about secularism, but I'm just wondering. I mean, by the Middle Ages, you have, I think, a much more robust rabbinic consensus around ideals of companionate marriage between men and women. And so, I mean, when I listen to this, it strikes me to have certain parallels with a lot of the work people like Jude Baskin and people who did really pioneering work on women in rabbinics and showed how many things were, only became calcified in terms of binary categories around certain categories of mitzvot and things much later than the Talmudic period. And so I'm wondering if you see this as also that kind of story, or do you think there's more at play still, whether it's until Shemara or, across a longer temporal scope? I guess a part of that question is whether we have, that you know of, any kind of responsa literature around androgynous, for instance, right? I mean, like that.
That's a great question.
But it's a somewhat unfair question because it's taking you well beyond the Talmudic period.
When I first wrote the book proposal, I was like, I'm going to do all of the reception history of these texts all the way up into it was like ridiculous. That didn't totally happen. It's a great question. I know that there's a master's thesis that talks about these categories in Rambam. So there's some work thinking about how these categories are developed. And of course, right, the interpretation of these sources in different times and places will be different. That's the nature of interpretation. I'm slightly allergic in general to ideas of like kind of progress narratives, like things get more complicated. But whether they get more solidified, that is totally possible. Because at some point, I think I referred to rabbinic law as a system. That's right. So it's not a system.
We can talk more about that.
Right. So it's not a system. It's not systematic. Part of the interesting piece is that even if Rabbi Yossi is trying to expel the androgyne from rabbinic literature, he utterly fails in that project, right? The androgyne is going to haunt us all through the Talmud, and it is going to be a part of that reception history as well. So it's a partial expulsion at best. But it's a great question that I don't totally have the answer to. I could see it going in that way where we see more consolidation, but I would have to remind myself what Rubin argues in that thesis.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, this is going to follow up on it. It's so nice to hear this in this way, but I mean, arguably, because I'm going to say this. Arguably, this is not just a historical, trajectory issue. It's an issue within within the Mishnah and the Talmud, right? Not for nothing do we have an entire Seder developed to shoring up the institution of marriage, and to some degree, or to a large degree, the rabbinic project is one that really works very, very hard on that institution and making sure that that institution works for purposes of whatever. Reproductive, as you discussed also, right? Reproductive transparency, so to speak. So you have that within the system, not just you don't have to go to medieval. There it becomes calcified because they're trying to figure it out right there. So what are you going to do with that, right? Because when it comes down to it, it really always means, right, you want to end up to, even if you change the ontology and the epistemologies, you want to end up with her and him that will, or several hers and one him, that will, right, guarantee that reproductive transparency.
Mm-hmm. Yes, they are certainly very invested in elaborating the laws of marriage and creating a whole framework and structure around it. Also the laws of divorce, but, right, and then the piece about mamzerim, like all of those, we have to understand those as part of the frameworks and the disciplinary frameworks of marriage, right, when you develop all of these consequences. Right, that's a part of it as well. Yeah.
I'm still kind of hung on the story about Rabbi and Elazar ben Shammua, and so what is Elazar ben Shammua kind of famous for, if he is at all, in
He's
other
a-
rabbinic sources?
Yeah, he's a well-known rabbi as well, right? So it makes
For what kind of sayings? Or I guess I'm trying to figure out, like, what is this, like, one excerpt that we know of the Torah of Rabbi Elazar ben Shammua? Does it mean, is the story telling us, the only thing that they let me learn was something insignificant? Is it saying the only thing that they let me learn was, I don't know, something about sex? Is this like, what kind of a diss is this?
Yeah.
What
So-
kind of an...
Yeah, so for this story, we actually have an earlier Palestinian version that's really difficult, I will say. It does, that version of the story, first of all, it's missing the roosters, so that's a later addition. It's not in the first person. We don't usually have stories told in the first person. Think about oral literature, it can get confusing anyways, right? So this is pretty rare. So that original story, the earlier version, is not in the first person, doesn't have the roosters. There's some changes, but it does seem to implicitly suggest that this is a critique of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. So the earlier version of the story suggests that this is a critique of his worthiness to study with their teacher. This is a diss. Implying, I think, that the text he learns is not that important. That's the kind of message. I think that's my interpretation, that this is the text is not insignificant.
Marginal, irrelevant.
This is what you get, right? This is what you get. This not very generative, not very fruitful text, but literally and figuratively. Work with that, right? So if that is so, then the possible critique of the students, like emphasizing with the roosters, that might be a later addition to the story. Like if you buy my reading that there is also a critique of the students who don't allow access to their teacher. These aggressive roosters, like why are they aggressive? What's the point of this? They're nameless, he's not. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's a major figure. Like your diss did not work, right? In the long run, we know who he is. We do not know who you are, right? So if that's true, then that's a later addition to the story. That's a kind of recouping.
Can I just follow
Yeah,
up?
yeah.
It's so interesting. I mean, I'm wanting to rebel against this question I'm asking because I don't like where it takes us. But it strikes me that, I mean, I think that's what you just said is quite compelling. What worries me about it is that it suggests that they're really talking about this kind of question as a marginal question, as like this like little thing, like why did they care about that, right? Like, I mean, so that, I don't know, like what do we do with that, and do we think that there's a genesis that's older, or like, I mean, because unfortunately we're pretty much all familiar with contexts today in normative Orthodox settings where you would hear someone kind of probably say something like that, right? And so it just makes me think about.
Yes. So I think there is definitely, certainly the earlier version of the story. Now you have it in Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's perspective. So again, like they've shifted it. It seems like your dis is not effective. But the original implication, I think, that this is not an important text, yeah, that is one strain. On the other hand, they also talk about androgynes and eunuchs prolifically, a lot, all over the place. So you can't, I mean, right, like when I get into arguments about, yeah, but this is just like, these are the unicorns of the Talmud, like, why waste time on something that's not serious? They are very serious about working out all the implications for levirate marriage at length with eunuchs and androgynes. So they, on some level, whether this story exhibits that or not, they at some level take this seriously as a topic that needs to be thought through in relation to law, and is a really good venue also for thinking through questions of gender and law, right? So if we understand that text to be one of the, it's not the list, right? The way back here, the list is like not just reflecting gender and law, but it's actually a central moment of constructing gender and law. Then that means that androgynes, for better or worse, are very central to this project of gender and ontology in law.
There's also some homoerotic things going on there with the whole chavua.
Yeah. So this, if you look at the Hebrew here, the tarnagolim, so it's not the other word for rooster, which is, yes, which is more obvious, right? But there is a kind of linguistic association already in Tannaitic, like old in Tannaitic Hebrew, between genitalia, masculinity, and the rooster. Like, that's not just a pun in English. That also works for them. So there is some of that feeling there, and also actually in Greco-Roman cultures we see some of that.
Yeah, and the teaching that they give him is about homosexual intercourse.
Yes, men lying with men. Yes. So what does it mean to have an androgyne, to lie with an androgyne? Is that men lying with men? What kinds of sex acts mean that? That is the Levitical prohibition. Yeah, that is the basic question of that source. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, so my question is sort of about the selection of texts that you've used. And it's sort of about the polemic. There's a lot more here than the polemic against that particular white Christian interpretation of the story of Genesis. But there's a famous midrash about Zachar v'Nekeva Baraotam, that they were created androgynous.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious why you chose these texts to focus on in order to sort of deconstruct that interpretation of the text when there is a midrash that's in a way more obvious. But all people, we're all actually we're all the descendants of an androgynous creation, and that midrash also has all sorts of weird things going along with it, because afterwards God separates his time and finishes up as a big zivugim. So somehow this androgynous being that's created somehow gets trans. It's no longer androgynous. It becomes something else, so that then we can bring them as. All of that is in there, and would seem to me to be a great way to go about saying, if this is what you think the Bible originally meant, well, there's some pretty well documented rabbinic texts that say that would have been.
Yeah, and that's the midrash. Also, they'll cite Genesis 1:27, right? That same verse. That's what they're using as their proof text, the oddities of the grammar of that verse. It's a great midrash. A lot of other people have written about it before me, and I stayed a little closer to the halachic materials in the book. But that is part of the backdrop. That's what I'm citing as. Yes, but if that's what you think Genesis means, here we have we have this bria, we have this creation, and that brings us to this whole midrash, which is a very complicated and very different understanding. And there's been work that looks at how that midrash is playing with other creation narratives that are circulating in the time about a kind of staged creation. Daniel Boyarin, quite famously, has worked on some of these stories, and Judith Baskin, but for sure, right, that when I'm talking about Genesis and those other midrashim, that's what I'm referring to, is that very famous midrash. And it's a great story. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it.